Right.
All right, are we good?
Yep.
Yay. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Design Elements and Color Basics. Thank you to all of you who've been consistently coming to all the Bloom workshops. We're super happy to have you here, and I hope that you're able to at least learn something or two from this presentation. Oh wait, I can't change slides. Ah, okay, there we go. So today, just a little bit of what we're going to be covering. We're going to be going over elements of design that aren't blocks in Canva. I hate Canva. How to use color and not look like a clown, and just a couple back pocket design tips that I've used over my design career in order to just have something to go off of when I'm often creatively dry. All right, there we go. So just a little bit about me. I'm a second year design, media, arts, and communications major. And this year I'm Adobe's ambassador for UCLA. So I basically just work on trying to make Adobe accessible to students and raising awareness for the things that it can do, especially for students in quarantine and just creatively. And also I'm going to be planning a couple of workshops that will be coming up later this year and this quarter. So stay tuned for those. And additionally, I am definitely a caffeine addict and an aspiring chef. I've just been doing a lot of cooking in quarantine, and it's pretty much just how I've been keeping myself sane with all the design work that I've been doing. So without further ado, let's just get straight into it. So today we'll be talking about elements and color, and I'm just going to be breaking down later what components go into each of these parts. And just as a side note, as we said in the last workshop, I am by no means an expert, but this is just the knowledge that I've gathered both from my own personal research and the little bit of experience that I've been able to get. So first of all, we're going to talk about elements. And actually, when I say elements, I'm going to be talking about elements and principles. So elements in design are kind of like the means, like the tools that you're using in order to put designs together. And principles are the ways. So like the strategies and the different systems that you can use to manipulate elements to create successful designs. So the 7 elements of design, just in a nutshell, are form, shape, line, color, texture, space, and value. And I know this might seem like a lot just at first glance, but these are really, first of all, by no means exhaustive. It's really hard to quantitate what really makes up design, but these are just really easy ways for you to start to conceptualize as a beginner what different things are going on when you look at a design and what makes a design really successful. So don't feel like you have to memorize this all now. We're going to be breaking down each individual topic, but this just gives you an idea of what really composes design, which is what we're trying to make sense of today. So the first element is shape. So obviously, shape is kind of ambiguous, right? It can be 2D, flat, geometric, square, circle, anything. But shape is basically just giving a name to the visual objects that you're using in design. And it's really important that we're aware of shapes as their own entity, because without really understanding what we're using in design, how are we going to be able to come up with strategies for them? So literally, for demo purposes, you have the Creative Labs frog. And building off of that, line is the second element. So different than shape, which consists of both the line and the fill of an object, line is kind of like the outer form. Just thinking of it purely as line work is probably all you really need. But especially in designs that aren't all necessarily filled objects, lines are really useful tools to be able to really understand the dynamics of your design and obviously play around with transparencies and all of the different kinds of things. So horizontal, vertical, diagonal, and just understanding which directions the different objects and dynamics, I keep saying, in your design are going. The third element is form, which is kind of like line and shape put together, but in a more 3D and lateral sense spatially. So I'm talking about 3D, geometric, and organic, and really just giving another dimension and understanding to how you're moving around the objects in your space. So as you can see, using a layered frog, that's combining both shape and line, but then adding more of them together to create a different shape, and that's why we call it form. The fourth element is color. So we're going to be breaking down this later in this workshop because it's such an intense realm of study on its own. Like color theory and color is, you can take multiple courses just on that. But really what you have to understand about color is that it's just all about relationships and about matching like vibes and tones and moods. And it's all about playing with light versus dark, saturation, temperature, and tint, tone, and shade. And then value is just the lightness and darkness of a color. So a little bit of vocabulary. A tint is when you're adding white to a color to make it lighter, and black is a shade is when you're adding black to it to make it darker. So not necessarily going on like a gradient from red to green, but just like within the scope of say blue, for example, adding black to blue to make it darker versus adding white to blue to make it lighter. So with the example of black, this is just a little bit of what shade versus tint looks like. So you can see it's very flat, but it gives you more like tones within the spectrum of this shade itself, or this color itself rather. And then texture, I was struggling to find an image to adequately represent it, but it's really just, I mean, it's self-explanatory. The feel, the appearance, the thickness, rough, smooth, or grainy. If you're using like objects that have texture in them, then that's a little bit more obvious, but even using objects that don't necessarily have gradient or texture, like image-like texture, there is texture that goes on with every single design. So it's important that you're thinking of texture not only as something that looks like you can actually touch it, but composed of all the other elements that I listed before. So shape, line, color, etc. They're all really related. And then space is basically just the area around, within, or between images and objects in your design. So it's really important that you understand positive versus negative space, which is basically positive space is like the object itself, like in your focal field, and negative space is the space that's around it. So when we look at designs, we often only see the object itself, right? Or like we're only thinking of the parts of the design that stick out to us, but we're not really conscious of the fact that what makes the design and what makes that object stand out is the dynamic and usage of all the space around it. So a space, an object might seem like really great in a design and complement other elements if it's more in the foreground, but that can only be possible if the background and the negative space around it is really embracing that object and creating the balance that makes that design work. And then the 7 principles of design, which as a reminder are basically just the ways of using the elements to create dynamic designs, are pattern, contrast, emphasis, balance, scale, harmony, and movement. So yeah, think of these as the ways, and then the elements are the means. And again, this is by no means exhaustive, but these are just a couple of the basic building blocks that should be able to get you started and get you thinking about and really studying designs themselves. So for pattern, we all know what a pattern is. It's just an arrangement of alternating and repeating elements and objects. And this deals a lot with a couple of the other things that I mentioned, like positive, negative space, and yeah, basically everything. And then contrast related to patterns is just juxtaposing different elements of the design. So for example, contrasting rough versus smooth texture, dark versus light value, and it really highlights differences and creates a strong focal point in your design if you use it correctly. So usually every good design I found relies on some level of contrast, whether it's obvious or not. Like with the example of this image, you can clearly see a contrast between the kinds of faces, the light picture and the dark background, and then the bright yellow text. But even in designs that use more pastel colors or more muted tones and really organic shapes, there still has to be some level of contrast for it to adequately communicate and for it to be a design that really pops and like catches our eye. So whether it's obvious or not, contrast is pretty much, I think, the most important principle I've come across, but something you always want to keep in the back of your mind. And it's also something that's really easy and fun to play with, no matter what design you choose to make. And this is just another picture that I found of contrast because I couldn't decide which one I wanted to use. I like them both, but I feel like this one just gives a much more kind of like deep example of contrast, specifically with relation to like textures and space. I know probably not a lot of people have done work with like 3D and stuff yet, but once you like start to get more advanced in design and you can do things like 3D posters or motion posters, playing with different levels of contrast really make work stand out the most. And then another principle is emphasis. So this kind of relates to contrast, but this is specifically paying attention to one specific element and creating that singular focal point that makes designs so powerful. So this mostly utilizes placement, like for example, in this image, like the hand coming from the right side and going across the whole page, contrast, such as like the solid forms of the type and then the really fluid portrayal of the hand and the skin, and then repetition, like the constant like water flow ripples across the hand and the red text consistent in all the different sides, and color, which is that contrast between that kind of artificial chemically red and the really natural textured skin tone of the hand. And then movement is just recurring elements and contrasting angles in the placement of your objects that really creates a feeling of dynamic rhythm and motion in your design. So this is just a really obvious example. You can see these lines bending together are making this illusion of a 3D tunnel. But even if it's not something that's supposed to be 3D, it's still really important to have some kind of movement in your design, whether it's just type or full of objects. So for example, using strong hierarchy and typography still creates movement because there's an order to what you're reading and an order to where your eye is flowing across the page. And that's really the key. So yeah, just even if you're not using or making a design that's super heavy on images and symbols, movement will really help people better understand the information that you're conveying in your design and help you create a design that really does what you want it to do. And then balance is just, again, hierarchy and established order of importance. Because if everything in your design in front of you is screaming out with equal attention, how are you supposed to know what to focus on? And that's probably one of the biggest mistakes, which I'll cover later, which I think a lot of beginners and even myself make, is not establishing a clear enough balance between what you should be paying attention to, what you shouldn't be paying attention to, and like with this poster having like warm and cool colors and also balance of these objects and directions in different parts of the page. And often just tweaking a little bit of like placement or a little bit of exaggerated hierarchy in any design can pretty much solve most of your problems. And balance doesn't have to be symmetrical. It can also be an asymmetrical design. But having, again, hierarchy and clear order between information and between important objects is the key to having a balanced and successful design. And then scale is just playing with perspective and the sizes of things relative to each other. So with the example of the yellow poster, having that volleyball in the foreground really big and the person behind it makes you feel like you're like the ball is coming at you and you're really in this kind of interesting dynamic perspective with this text literally coming into your face. And that's only possible because of scale, making the ball larger than it otherwise would be relative to a person if you were putting them on the same flat plane. And establishing that relationship between like the punch text and the person behind it, and then the small text at the bottom. And this is also a great example of balance and of contrast and really established hierarchy order. So as you can see, all of those things coming together is what makes this design successful. But in order to make this design yourself, you have to really understand all of those different components. And then harmony is just the arrangement of elements like color, typography, etc., to make something that's cohesive and that really feels like parts of a whole. So with the example of brand identity, like for this, I think it's granola bars, even though they have a lot of different colors that they use in their branding and in their packages, there are a lot of things that actually are consistent, which is like the brightness and the energy of the colors that they chose, and that each package has a very high contrast between warm and dark colors, and then also small little patterns and decorations, and this smooth kind of, I don't want to say pastel, but very kind of like calm baseline color underneath it, if that makes sense. And additionally, the consistent numbers and that type being really bold and strong in the corner is what really keeps this whole thing together, even though they're using red, yellow, blue, orange, purple, and colors that you would otherwise think would be too many for a cohesive brand. All right, so that was a lot of information, I know, and you're probably thinking, okay, what do I do with all of this vocabulary? Like, even if I know all these different topics in my head, how can I use this to make my designs better and to really just get into design in general? So we're going to be just going over a couple common mistakes that I definitely know from experience, some rules of thumb that I've come up with that I pretty much just lean on every time I'm stuck when designing, and some suggestions that I have for learning how to practice design and just get in the flow of being creative, I guess. So the first number one common mistake I always see and do occasionally myself is using unnecessary elements. So in order for a design to adequately communicate, as we discussed, we need things like balance and contrast, right? And if there's too many individual elements that are all like trying to get attention, even if they're smaller, if it's unnecessary, it's going to take away from the quality of your design. And what I mean by unnecessary is things that aren't directly contributing information that you wouldn't know without it. So for example, like for our Bloom branding, for example, Bloom, we have a flower icon, right? But if I just covered our web page with leaves along with the bloom and the flower, like sure, I could make it look nice, but it's not necessary. And it's going to take away from the communication of the website, and it's going to take away from the power of the bloom and the exclamation point itself. And then the second most common mistake is always like a lack of strong hierarchy. And this relates very strongly back to the typography lesson that Justin did last week. So if you haven't watched that, I recommend you take a look. It'll really help with this presentation. But not having a strong hierarchy, you're going to confuse whoever you're designing for because they're not going to know what exactly you're trying to say. For most of us, when we're going about our daily lives, like looking at designs or taking in design from the world around us, we don't really have the time to sit down and analyze every single design we see and be like, like, what is this designer really trying to say? What are all the different like parts that they were trying to use to communicate? We just look at something, and if we don't get the message, we move on. And if we do get the message, we still move on, but it stays in our heads. So you need to make sure that you have a strong hierarchy and strong contrast so that the pieces of information that matter most will stay with the people whom your design interacts with. Otherwise, it's basically rendered useless, and all the work that you've done is kind of going to be for nothing, as dramatic as that sounds. And then the third mistake, which will be covered in the other half of this presentation, is just bad use of color. This goes back to contrast, this goes back to balance, but if you have good elements and you have good placement, but they're in colors like with this image that are kind of at war with each other, like all screaming for too much attention, both the background and the foreground kind of like fighting each other, it's really distracting and it's hard for your design to communicate. So color along with contrast is definitely one of the most crucial things about good designs, and it takes a while to master, but once you take the time to really study it and understand what's going on in good designs that makes them successful, it'll really help you improve your own designs a lot faster and just be more successful in general. I know I keep saying the same thing, but yeah. And then my personal rules of thumb, just for whenever you feel stuck in your design, or if it looks bad and you can't figure out like what to do about it, which is pretty much me every time I make something. My first suggestion is just whenever you're in doubt, like you don't know what you want to do for a particular design, especially if you're making design for an organization or for a specific entity that already exists, just use type. Like go back to the basics. Don't worry about all like the complicated cool effects and imagery or whatever, and just practice using really strong type and really strong layout. Because at the end of the day, design is about communication, right? And so what we really need to do is not just fill designs with things that are pretty, but use design to communicate what we need to communicate, what the purpose of the design truly is. So I always just, at least for me personally, default to using just typography. because there's actually a lot that you can do with typography itself that can be really visually interesting, but it really helps you stay away from the distractions of like filling things up with cool effects that don't actually do anything for you. And then my second tip is just to always use as few elements as possible. Again, going back to the whole issue of distraction and muddling the communication, unless a specific effect is really contributing to your design, or if it's crucial for a brand that you've created or that you're designing for, the fewer elements you use, and obviously the better you use them, the better your design will be, because each part can really have its own spotlight to be focused on and to really accomplish like its full potential in your design, rather than competing with too many other things that might be pretty, but then you're really only getting like 50% of the potential from each element, like cool stickers or like holographic effects or like flash or whatever. None of that is really powerful if there's all of it going on at once. And then don't be afraid to recycle at all. Some people always think that like being a designer means you have to come up with a genius idea every time, or every new piece that I make has to be my next masterpiece, or like anything like super industrious like that. And honestly, like the reality is that especially for brands and accounts that already exist, what's important is having a sense of cohesiveness and consistency. So even though there is a time and place for, you know, making super loud over the top masterpieces, when it just comes down to designing for everyday life, at least what I found is using similar elements and similar tools and just using them in slightly different ways, but like recycling concepts and relationships between elements is really what helps me get the designs done. Not only just because getting them done is better than not done, but because making every single piece like its own attention demanding independent masterpiece, like with design elements, takes away from all of them altogether. You kind of have to choose in a way which ones you want to really shine and which ones need to be almost like the supporting. So I guess this is like more relevant for people who might be designing for clubs or for social media and anything else like that. But I just think that it also helps take some pressure off of you as a creative to constantly be like pressing yourself to make the absolute like best genius work you possibly can, because I'm definitely not a genius. But it's just important to keep creating. And then white space is your only real friend in this world, let's be honest, because white space, like with the whole positive negative space thing that I discussed, it's what really allows all of the elements that you choose to use to come alive. And instead of cluttering it, or instead of really looking for ways to push the boundaries of individual elements, sometimes just good old type and white space, like I did on this slide, is all you really need to make something that's effective. So just because something has a lot of white space doesn't mean that it's plain. And in a way, it'll force you, especially as a beginner designer, to really come to terms with like the basics and fundamentals of layout and grid structures, and using and understanding the dynamics of typography and really basic elements that'll solidify your foundational skills as a designer, and allow you to take on more advanced projects in the future. So yeah, those are just my 4 general tips. And then definitely, as everyone always says, the most important thing to being a good designer or good anything is just practice. But I know that at least in quarantine, it's really hard to figure out and maintain a consistent schedule of practicing design, because we're all burnt out, we're all tired, we're all dealing with, you know, constant like Zoom lectures or even recorded lectures. And without a community to be able to talk with face to face, you lose a lot of the kind of interaction and community that makes design magical to me. So I know it's hard, but definitely in quarantine, like with more time to yourself, I think this is a valuable time for you to try to learn to um, really harness your own individual creativity and look for all the resources that are actually available online to help you develop like yourself as a designer, and not have the same level of pressure and competition that you might have learning design in an in-person environment, like with other people around you. So just a couple things that I thought of off the top of my head for learning how to practice design on your own, especially as someone who might not come from a design background or from someone who doesn't have access to a design program or to design community. I think just first of all, being aware of what design really catches your eye and what design you like, whether that be like graphic design, packaging design, motion design, music videos, or whatever. Redesign your favorite anything. So choose one thing that you really like the design of, and perhaps something that you might see every day, like, I don't know, your Spotify playlist, or maybe a particular poster that you might have seen anywhere, and just redesign it. Like redesign it to either be something that you think would be better or to be a completely different spin on it. Like maybe if you chose to do a packaging design, you could repurpose like a milk carton to become some kind of like made up drink, and like make all the branding and like label, logo, and design and everything for that bottle. And just get in the groove of kind of like reshaping things and kind of questioning and rethinking things that already exist. I think that just gets you like in a really good design mindset overall, but also it's really fun to be able to take something that you enjoy and kind of put your own handprint on it. And then also following YouTube tutorials is legitimately so helpful. Like even me as a design media arts major, I still do that, like along with all of my dozen of classes that I take, because there's just so much of like a wealth of information online. And sometimes there are just, you know, really specific tools or techniques and stuff that you want to know that your professor might not teach you in class, or that, you know, a friend might not know, but there's no reason why you can't know it because it exists on the internet already. So this has really helped me learn how to do like cool techniques, and also just give me newer insights on how to use Adobe programs, for which there are usually like 7 ways to do the same thing. So being able to learn at least a couple more of them can really speed up your workflow. And then you don't have to be in a design position in order to make design work. I know that it's definitely easier when you have a fire under your butt and you're like being held accountable by someone to make designs for a deadline. But I feel like a lot of my best work has actually come from when I didn't necessarily have that pressure, and the only pretty much guiding principle I had was whatever looked best to me. So even if you aren't necessarily like a designer for a club or working for a company or like interning somewhere, just doing, you know, personal projects or designing something for a friend, like designing an album cover for someone who makes music, or designing a poster for someone who might have an event coming up. And all those other kinds of side gigs are really, really, really good practice for you to start working with different mediums and to just play with things that are related to design in the real world versus like just what might be like in your head. So don't be afraid to like take the initiative, and definitely don't dismiss any potential opportunity as a non-worthwhile design opportunity, because especially as a beginner, like any experience is good experience. So yeah. And then the second half, or just tail end of this presentation pretty much, is just going to be a brief introduction to color. So like I said before, color is its own whole, excuse me, world. You could honestly spend hours and hours like just researching it and learning new things about it, because it's such a science, especially like psychologically, in terms of like cognitive science or whatever. We're not going to cover any of that here, but I'm just going to be discussing a couple of the things related to color that I use most often. But I highly suggest that if this is interesting to you, or if you just want to know more, literally just Google search anywhere. Or if you have Skillshare or Coursera, take a couple classes on there. And even if it seems super technical or super boring, just having the background knowledge of the science behind how color works really, really helps you start to improve, and be conscious of why things do or don't work in design. So yeah, this is an extreme TLDR version. But just to start, colors are something that's always mixed, but something that I feel like people just don't understand very well, because they're usually done wrong. And especially in beginner designs, I always felt like my biggest struggle was that I couldn't ever get the exact right shade that I wanted. which sounds dumb because when you're working on Adobe, it's literally just a matter of clicking on the shade that you want, like clicking the exact right pixel. But I felt like I always struggled to learn the balances between different colors. And, I would look at one color on the left and one color on the right and wonder like, why don't they look good together? Because like looking at them just in their own space or side by side, they look great. But then when you actually put them onto an object or incorporate them into your design, suddenly it doesn't look good anymore. So hopefully this will give you a little bit more clarity. What I think you really need to know about colors is just the kinds of relationships that they have to each other, and just emphasizing the concept of contrast. And then for at least the modern age or this kind of age of enlightenment that we're going through, accessibility. So what do I mean by that? So color relationships, again, it's kind of a science, but there are a couple rough categories that we've put groups of colors into and given names because of their positions on the color wheel. So complementary colors are specifically colors that are exactly across from each other on the color wheel. So for example, like green to red, yellow to purple, or blue to orange, just straight across. And these obviously have very high contrast and can often produce a lot of energy if used correctly. But again, this is just a name, putting a name to a relationship, or like a name to a face. But once you're aware of those relationships, mixing colors gets easier. And then the next kind is analogous colors. So these are colors that are right next to each other on the color wheel. And they have, as you can see, a lot of like harmony. They work really well together. It gives you kind of like a calming sense of peace. And even though there's not a lot of contrast, it still feels like a decent system that you could make a design with. And then monochromatic is just using a bunch of different shades and tints from the same hue. So just as a reminder, there was supposed to be shade under this, but tint is adding white to produce a color, and then shade is adding black to produce a color. So adding the white and the black on different ends of like the spectrum of this like red block, for example, is what produces this gradation of different colors. And you'll see for some designs, I feel like it's a little bit more rare, but there are designs that use monochromatic color schemes, and it can usually be used to convey kind of like peace, harmony, but also something a little bit more sophisticated because there's such a smooth transition between the different shades of this hue that you're using. And then triadic is basically just colors that form an equilateral triangle with respect to each other on the color wheel. So just like making that exact same angle. And I guess this picture uses blue, purple, or pink and orange. But if you just imagine that triangle being rotated, that'll show you like loosely the other kind of like relationships between triadic colors on the color wheel. So it kind of gives you a sense of like, primary color combinations. Like if you use a bad hue, it could seem kind of like kindergarten with just like red, blue, and yellow. But if you use more like secondary colors, like the colors between red, blue, and yellow, or a slightly lighter or darker tint or shade of the colors, it can actually produce something that's really nice and works great as a design system for pretty much anything. So yeah, the list goes on. There's like a whole list, if you Google it, of different names of different color relationships. But I think the most important ones to know are just triadic, monochromatic, analogous, and complementary, because those are the most common and kind of the most fundamental and basic. And I feel like once you get a good understanding of those and how they're used in the real world, it gets a lot easier to learn how to make your own color systems and incorporate good colors in your design, especially for things that are more reliant on a solid design system, like a brand or a UI design, and other things like that. Yeah, and then just the final concept that I really, really, really want to stress is contrast. So contrast literally for anything, whether it's textures or colors or anything else that I've discussed so far, contrast is pretty much the easiest and most fundamental way to make a design that like pops, or a design that's successful and really communicates. As I've said over and over again, like if too many objects or too many elements of your design are competing for the same level of attention, it's not going to communicate, right? But pretty much every design uses some level of contrast, and that contrast is what creates movement and dynamic and stuff in your design. So if you ever feel like you're stuck, or if you ever feel like your design just isn't looking the way that you visualized it in your mind, it's usually going to be something at least related to contrast. So always keep it in the back of your mind, and it'll spare you a lot of time just like being upset with the stuff that you make. So yeah, if your colors look dull or chaotic, I suggest checking the actual location of the hex code on a color wheel. And for those of you that don't know, the hex code is basically the 6-digit code that's attached to every shade. So for example, like if you use Adobe, or honestly any other design software, whenever you're picking a color on the color wheel, there will be like a letter and number sequence next to it, which is kind of like the ID tag of that color. And checking the hex codes that you're using in your design online, whether it be through like a contrast checker or anything else you might want to use, can actually give you a quantitative number to answer like why your design might not be sticking out, or like why two colors might not be working too well together. So yeah, when in doubt, just check the actual number and you'll be surprised. And then make sure you're not using absolute black. So there might be cases in which absolute black might work, or it might be actually needed. But what I've experienced is that using just complete absolute black with no color like shade to it whatsoever kind of kills design, because it makes it feel very flat and very harsh. So, I mean, for example, if you look around you, like in reality, nothing is ever really completely black. It might have a little bit of green or a little bit of blue or red or purple in it. Like even like really dark hair isn't completely black. It's like slightly brown in the sun, right? And so making sure to not use absolute black helps designs look a lot more natural. And that's pretty much the only way you can get black to work with other colors that you might be using. So if you're using a design scheme that has a lot of blue or purple, having a black that you actually select like from the blue section of the color wheel and then just dragging it down to the black kind of area, but not hitting the absolute corner, will give you what looks like black on screen, but because of that slight blue tone, it'll be a lot more harmonious with the other colors that you're using versus just a complete harsh black, which just I feel like never really fits in any design. And then try using shadows. I mean, this is pretty much goes back to point number 2, but use shadows and tints and hues that are related to the other colors that you're using. So if you're making a drop shadow, for example, instead of just making it a gray drop shadow, if you have like red text or like orange images and green somewhere in your design, experiment with using drop shadows that are slightly tinted towards that color, or might be that color itself, instead of using absolute black. Or if you're trying to add a highlight to something, like say you're painting a ball and the ball is purple, like instead of just painting the highlight to be white, like try experimenting with like a slightly bluer white or a purple white or a green white, and it gives it a lot more of a kind of ethereal tone to it, depending on how neon your highlight color is. But it just feels a lot more natural that way versus just kind of draining the color of its vibrance by adding complete plain white. So yeah, that's just colors in a nutshell. And related to that is accessibility. So for people who are colorblind or might be slightly like legally blind or any other kind of visual impairment, a lot of designs that are created, especially for industry or commerce, are not at all considerate of these people and of accessibility in general. So recently, I think the design world is kind of finally starting to wake up to the importance of accessibility, but I think it's extra important as beginner designers to understand that this is an important thing to be aware of, so that as you go into the design field or as you create designs, especially that are mostly intended for mass audiences, that you're really keeping in mind that your design should be for everyone, or it should be considerate of people who might not be able to otherwise experience it from no fault of their own. So pretty much the easiest way to really incorporate accessibility in your designs is to use online contrast checkers. Like I said before, to check the hex codes of your colors and make sure that, like, for example, for text on a background, that the contrast ratio between the text and the background is high enough for anyone to be able to see. Um, I'll share a screenshot in the next slide, but basically when you enter these hex codes into the website, it'll give you an actual number ratio, and it'll say whether or not that ratio is like good or bad for like different kind of standardized levels of accessibility and contrast ratios. So yeah, just keep that in mind and always ask for feedback and review. So feedback is important for any design that you make, like at any time ever. Like feedback and critique is the only way you're going to grow as a designer. But especially if you're creating like social media posts, or if you're working for any kind of nonprofit organization or an organization that's trying to do, especially like, you know, social good, making sure that your designs are clear and accessible to anyone is important. But sometimes it's much more effective to just ask people directly, or to just get a general scan of feedback on your designs and then improving them from there, instead of always trying to guess what your audience might be thinking. So yeah, just constantly ask for feedback and review, and don't be afraid to reach out to people and to just get more input on your designs so that you can improve them. So this is a picture of the contrast checker websites that I was mentioning. I personally like to use WebAIM because it's a little bit more standardized and gives you like all these different kind of like standard level approvals. Like I'm not going to read out all the letters, but it's like at the bottom. So this is obviously where you would then put in the hex codes of your foreground, background, etc., and see the spit out of the contrast ratio. And it takes like 2 seconds, but it gives you kind of like an extra confirmation or, you know, warning or insight whenever you're making something, and it's pretty important to use. So use it if you can. I mean, no one's gonna come after you if you don't, but I feel like as a designer, ethically, you should want to. And then another resource that I just wanted to mention is Happy Hues Co. So it's basically just a website that helps you kind of generate like color schemes. And I think it also has like an accessibility thing built in. But it's just a really fun site that gives you some fun color palettes, like if you might be stuck, and helps you see, like as they literally say on the website, curated colors in context. So giving you a better sense of how your colors would work systematically, like once you've started to edge towards deciding which ones you want to use. So yeah, that's the end of the presentation slash workshop. And I hope that was helpful to you guys in some way. And if you have any questions or even want any kind of design advice, I'd be more than happy to connect with you. So you can just look me up on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. And yeah, thank you so much for coming, everyone. Oh, and also, if anyone has questions, feel free to just drop them in the chat and I can just like answer them as people are leaving. But yeah, feel free.